Hi, class. Welcome to this lecture on James chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. Here we're going to deal with what is really the call to, the table of contents for the letter of James. And it comes in two sections, verses 2 through 12, and then 13 through 25, really, with 26 and 27 being the theme passages for the entire letter. And a double epitome is basically the epitome is the table of contents. Everything here will show up in the letter, and James is doing it in short preview. But then 13 through 25 actually kind of does it again. It's kind of a redo, almost like to get it in for real. So let's look at how the passage plays out and see how they work together. So chapter chapter 1 verses 2 through 12 and chapter 1 verses 13 through 25, they don't say the exact same thing, but they absolutely allude to what's coming in two different ways. So James chapter verses 2 through 4 deals with trials. 5 through 8 deals with prayer or ask. 9 through 11 deals with poverty and riches, or humility and riches. And then verse 12 comes back to trials, almost like the technical term would be like an inclusio. So there's these things called word chains that happen throughout chapter 1 that really connects each section. So in verses 2 through 4, it starts with Quran. It means joy. Consider it all joy, brothers. That's in verse 2. But verse 1 ends with Kairein, greetings. So you can see Kairein and Quran, these Greek verbs, knit these passages together. You get the same thing in verses 4 and 5. So that transition from one section to the other has this word chain, and lipomenoi and lipotai. So this is lack. So verse 5 says, if you lack wisdom, ask God. Verse 4 ends with so that you might be lacking in nothing. So there you have a word chain tying these things together. Same thing in verse 8 and verse 9. So as you change sections, verses 5 through 8 and 9 through 11, you have this word chain again. But it's not so much words that sound alike or look alike. It's a theme. So aner dipsakos, the two-faced man. Aner is man. Dipsakos is a big word in James. We'll talk about it a lot. You'll probably get tired of me talking about it. But it's an important word. Dai is two, sukos is soul or being. So a two-souled man, or double-minded is the way it's usually translated. I translate it two-faced because I really do think that's verbiage that we use today, and it's absolutely kind of accurate for what he's trying to say. This two-faced, and James is against anything that is two-faced, right? He is drawing this strong line between the Roman world and the way of Jesus, which is God, right? And so anybody who tries to do both of those is two-faced or dipsukos. And so you have this two-faced man, and then ha adelphos, ha tapainos means the humble man. So you get this, or humble brother. Yeah, it's adelphos is brother. Tapainos is humble. Meek is another way to translate that. So you get this word chain in verse 8 and verse 9 between a two-faced man and a humble brother, and it's not totally aner adelphos dipsukos tapainos. It kind of rolls off the tongue in Greek, but it's a word train. And then trials. This is real interesting. There's between verse 11 and 12, you get this plusios makarios, rich and blessed. So plusios means rich. It's literally where we get our word plus, even plush. But it literally means wealthy or rich. Makarios is blessed or happy. And this is an important word. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but Makarios is the same word in Matthew and Luke in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. That's important because this is looks like that section of Matthew and Luke, they're using the Q source, which predates both of them, and it is an early Jesus tradition. So, Makarios here, blessed, certainly kind of is a contrast between Plusios and creates more of these word chains. So, I follow Johnson. Johnson and I agree that there's strong connection in these verses. That means that there's intentional structure. And this is what the German scholar Martin Debelius, he argued against that. He thought James was a compilation of sayings that was kind of put together with not real careful thought put into it. But I think you can see that that's not the case just because of these word trains. But Debelius was the man. I mean, he was the commentator on James for decades. And then Luke Timothy Johnson came along with the Anchor Bible commentary, which is right there. It's why we're reading it. Dale Allison also has another commentary that just came out maybe a year ago in the International Commentary, Critical Commentary, ICC. It's from Bloomsbury or T&T Clark. That's another outstanding, probably another hallmark commentary. But Luke Johnson's commentary is the standard, I think. And what Johnson does is talk about. I mean, and most commentators agree with this. That in page 175 of the commentary, he says, "What is more important is to recognize the ways in which chapter 1 functions within the larger letter to anticipate themes developed more fully by way of essays." In other words, all the major sections of the letter of James, from chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, all the way to chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, every one of those major sections is found in microcosm in this first chapter. So you look in verses 2 through 4 and 12, talk about testing and trials. That's picked up in chapter 5, 7 through 11. Chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, this is picked up again, talking about the prayer. This is picked up again in 4, 3, and 5, 13 through 18. Verses 9 through 11, this divine reversal, this is a major theme in James. So you see that in chapter 2, 1 through 7, chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, and chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. That features large in this letter. So you see these larger sections of James being put into chapter 1, and it creates somewhat of a written table of contents. It gives you a preview of what the whole letter is going to have. So let's pay attention to these verses and really kind of get into them. So 2 through 4, you can talk about this as endurance because there's these trials, right? My brothers. Now, brothers is the word that's used here. It's plural, so it's more than one. It is not brothers and sisters in Greek. It is just adelphoi, which is Greek for brothers. Now, Greek was certainly like Spanish and some of the other Romance languages we have today, where when you talk to a group of people who are both male and female, you use the masculine plural form of the word. So if you wanted to address a large crowd like a church or an assembly or a synagogue that had men and women in it, the proper grammar in the language would be to use the masculine plural, and that's what adelphoi is masculine plural. So you could translate this brothers and sisters if you wanted to. I hold it, I kind of show the patriarchy behind the language itself in Greek, which is something that we should always acknowledge. The other part is there are moments in the letter where James actually uses sisters. the on-air dipsykos that we talked about just a second ago, that is a man. So he tends to be pretty intentional here. But I'd absolutely think he's being inclusive here, where he's referring to the whole church, which definitely would include sisters as well as brothers. So, my brothers, consider it all joy whenever you encounter various testings or trials. Um, since you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Now, this is the big deal. And let endurance yield a perfect product. Perfect's a big theme in James. In order that you might be perfect and whole, lacking nothing. All right, let's kind of pick this apart. So, he starts with Charan, which is connected to the end of verse 1, where he says Chirane, greetings. So you get some alliteration there. Consider in verse 2, the word consider and the word knowing seems to be like a concentration on correct cognitive character. Now, Johnson talks about this in more detail, but there's this movement between kind of cognition, knowing the right things, leads to doing the right things. So thought leads to action, and action is a big deal in the letter of James. So just notice how many times James uses kind of these cognitive words. Consider this, brothers, or knowing this, brothers and sisters, or any of that kind of domain of knowledge. It's important to James. Brothers, Adelphoi, we talked about that just a while ago. You encounter various kinds of trials. Look at the alliteration with P. Pyrosmois, peripesita, poikilois. This is the various, so encounter is peripesite. Poikilois is various kinds, and pyrosmois is the trials or testings. So in Greek, you have this kind of rhythm that's built on alliteration, and you just really can't translate this stuff in English, and this is one of the reasons I'm a New Testament scholar, so I'm totally biased with Greek, but Hebrew, I think Hebrew is very important too. So if you're going to be a Bible scholar, or if you're going to be somebody who deals with the Bible all the time, I think it's important to know the biblical languages. So spend some time trying to do that in your seminary life. If you're going into ministry, especially becoming a minister where you'll preach, this will come in handy to you. But you see the alliteration, the P, the pyrosmos, peripesite, poikilois. It is rhythmic and intentional. Whoever wrote it, James did. So various kind of trials, and then joy in trials. This is so consider it all joy, brothers, when you encounter various kind of trials. Joy in trials. This is utterly counterintuitive, and it is subversive. Now, it's nothing. This is not unique in the Greco-Roman world. There were a whole set of philosophers called Stoics that would say stuff like this. There's a lot of scholarship that talks about the early Jesus movement as somewhat of a Stoic movement. But it's more than just Stoicism here, and I think it's more than just counterintuitive. This is subversive. And it's subversive in the sense that trials, hard times, difficulties, bad health, bad luck, all this during the Roman imperial time, all this for Romans was considered being cursed by the gods. Joy, goodness, happiness, good things, winning wars, good weather, good crops, all that's attributed to God's blessing. And so to say you should take joy in trials is to be subversive to a Roman understanding of the world. So this is saying that your trials aren't something that's necessarily bad, and that it might be just what the world's doing to you. So take joy in it. It's subversive at some level. because the testing of your faith produces endurance. This is the first use of the word faith in James. Pistis is the Greek word, and it's connected to the work of endurance. So the word produces is how they're translating um, katargazata is produces, and there's really no other better way to translate it. It produces endurance. So faith produces endurance. Now, that's going to be important because later on, see, we're already kind of getting a semblance of what's going to happen later on in chapter 2, where the whole faith and work stuff. Here you have pistis directly connected to work. Faith works endurance, faith produces endurance. So faith isn't some kind of idle thing. It actually it does something. It Erga is the Greek word for work. So kat ergezeta, that is like a derivative of erga, to work. So endurance, and then endurance produces perfect work. Teleon, ergon. Again, you got work again. These are key themes. Perfect work, complete work. Teleon, perfect, ergon is work. And you see the katargazeta and ergon there right beside it, and kind of right on top of each other. You see the root erga being in that katargazeta. So the endurance produces. So faith produces, or faith works into endurance, and endurance works into perfect work. So work is very important. Ergon is very important to James. But so is this concept of perfect and whole, teleoi, from action to being, right? This is something that happens, and as you do it, it's who you are. It produces a perfect, you're whole. So just notice how the grammar works here. You saw this produce, this action, 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 work, 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 and that's what makes you perfect and whole. Lacking in nothing, right? Again, this is the word chain in verse 5, contrast between wholeness and lack. So this is what I'm trying to do with a close reading of these verses. I hope you gather a stronger understanding of these verses as we go through this. But we're now transitioning to 5 through 8, the prayer of faith. Now, this picture I took, this is in Washington, D.C., at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and this is where Dr. King preached the I Have the Dream speech in 1963. And you can see the August 28, 1963 at the bottom there. I just find, the idea of a prayer of faith, I think it's perfectly fitting to talk about Dr. King and not only what he did in this country, but the kind of faith and the motivation that he gave people to do what's right. I mean, his capacity to, it'd be real interesting to compare the letter from Birmingham jail to the letter of James, right? Letter from Birmingham jail coming from Dr. King to, the civil rights movement. The letter of James coming from Jerusalem to, the diaspora, those who are out there. Well, that's a total aside, but not really. In any case, 5 through 8 says, "But if any one of you lacks wisdom," the word "lacks" there goes back to verse 4. So check that out. If anyone lacks wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith. Again, pistis comes up again, without doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is tossed and turned by the wind. That sort of person should not think that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a two-faced man, unstable in all his ways. This is that word dipsukos again. So let's kind of break this apart. Lack, again, is that word chain in verse 4 and 5. Wisdom is important because wisdom here corresponds to a whole section on wisdom in chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Here you get wisdom given by God generously And then in chapter 3, verses 13 through 18, wisdom from above. It talks about wisdom from above, and then earthly, demonic wisdom, fleshy wisdom. So here, this kind of correspondence on, or this couple of verses on wisdom directly relates to what will happen in a fuller detail later on. And then in verse 5 and verse 6, it talks about pistis, faith versus doubting. This directly corresponds to chapter 2, verses 14 through 26 on the faith works binary. And then the double-minded two-face in verse 8 goes directly to chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, where he uses this word specifically in relation to kind of his enemies. So all these things prefigure. And then this unstable akatastatos. It's a great word. I mean, doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue, but man, when you can get it there, it's a fun one. Akatastatos. So unstable again comes up in chapter 3, verse 8, when it talks about the tongue is unstable. And then chapter 3, verse 16, dealing with wisdom. So I wanted you to see how all of these sections, all these verses correspond to sections that will happen later on. This is how this is a table of contents of sorts. In prayer in and of itself is kind of the last section. Chapter 5, verses 7 through 20 deals with prayer quite a bit. So that's how this kind of gives you a preview of what is ahead. So moving right along, 9 through 12 is incredibly important because this is a theme. I think that this was indicative of the early Jesus movement. This is some of the core teachings in Jesus of Nazareth, and the movement that Jesus of Nazareth started. I think this is some of the bedrock teachings that he gave to his disciples. And it was the concept of divine reversal. And it is utterly subversive. So if I talked a little bit a while ago about joy, consider it all joy when you face many trials because trials produces XYZ. That's certainly subversive, but this is probably the most subversive part of the letter of James, and I would argue that it's the most subversive part of the entire Jesus movement early on, and it's the concept of divine reversal. You certainly get it in Luke, you also get it in Matthew, some of it's in Mark. You hear it throughout some of the other letters of the New Testament. But this is where God turns the world upside down, right? Those who are in absolute power, like the Roman Empire, like the emperor himself, that power structure is completely turned upside down. And the people who are on the bottom, the last, become first, and those who are first become last. The top goes to the bottom, and the bottom goes to the top. And this is exactly what we find already in verses 9 through 12. So it says, let the humble brother boast in his exaltation. So humble, tapainos here, is important because it's like humble or meek, and is contrasted to the rich. It's not. It's interesting because it's not the word poor, patokos. James uses that later, but here he's talking about meekness, and this is the word that's used in one of the Beatitudes. Or a while ago, I was talking about makarios, the blessed part that's in the Q source, which is what Matthew and Luke used to write the Beatitudes. Well, here you find it in James. So let the meek brother, the humble brother, boast in his exaltation. Now, we don't know if this is some kind of eschatological concept that one day when Jesus comes back kind of thing, the humble and the meek will be exalted, or whether that's what they believe is happening right now. And the rich in his humiliation, the wealthy one in his humiliation should boast. The boast isn't used here, but it's implied. Because the wealthy one will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance perishes. Now, that section is very similar to what we find in the Gospel of Matthew in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6, where you're not supposed to worry about stuff. It's very similar in terminology. So that's also early Jesus material, Jesus tradition from Q, which is early, and it looks like James is borrowing from that tradition. Not necessarily, he doesn't necessarily have a writing in front of him, but he knows that tradition. So this makes you think that James is real early. In the same way as these flowers, the wealthy will wither away in his pursuits. Blessed, this Makarios, blessed is the man who endures trials. Again, going all the way back to verse 2. Because after being proven, he will receive the crown of life, which God promised to those who loved him. All right, let's spend some time here. Divine reversal. The humble versus the rich. This is again in chapter 2, verses 6 through 7. And even more profoundly in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, where the wealthy are utterly condemned. This is thoroughly part of early Jesus traditions. This section, verses 9 through 12, you have echoes in Luke, which came later, much later, 13 through 30. Matthew, which also came later. Matthew and Luke were probably written about the same time in like 80 to 90 or 85 to 95. They didn't know each other. They didn't have a copy of each other's gospel, but they did have a shared source that was what we call the Q source. It's even in the Gospel of Thomas. So this divine reversal is found in the early Jesus traditions, and James is a result of that. So humble, tapainos. It's not to be equated with poor, patokos, which is in chapter 2, verse 2, but it's similar. What's real interesting is the next word, boast, kalkastai. Besides the letter of James, the one time in Hebrews, it's Hebrews chapter 3, this word, boast, this word is only used in Paul's letters, and it's fairly common among Paul. So check out Johnson, what he says about it on page 185. Now, James uses this word again when he's criticizing merchants and itinerant preachers in chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. So, has James heard about Paul, the sermons that Paul talks about? Because Paul talks about boasting a lot, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And James is now picking up one of these Pauline terms and like using it against him. I think that's exactly what's happening, especially when you read chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. But again, this table of contents kind of thing gives you an idea of what we're going to hear later. So the divine reversal, the humble, those are the ones who are exalted and high. The rich, those are actually the ones who are low and humbled. It's actually a riff on the term. It actually says humbled. The rich should boast in their humility, in their humiliation. Rich plusios are treated harshly by James, again in these chapter 2 and chapter 5. And when I say treated harshly, chapter 5, there is no sense of repentance. They are utterly condemned. But this also follows certain Jesus traditions in Matthew 19, 23 through 24, Mark 10, 25 and 12, 41, Luke, those passages in Luke. And this is utterly subversive in Roman economy, where the emperor is at the very top. The emperor is the most plusios in the empire. He's the richest. He's the most powerful. He's an utter dictator at this point. And that's the one. He's the richest. He's the most number one of number ones. And James says that one should boast in his humility. And the lowest, the humble, the meek, the lowest in Roman culture, they should boast in their exaltation. So it's very subversive to Roman economy, and it also to do this, he talks about the transient nature of wealth, and this is rooted in the Septuagint. That whenever you see LXS XX, that's how we abbreviate Septuagint, and the Septuagint is literally the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So Isaiah 47 actually has James, he has a deep knowledge of the Septuagint, and he's probably picking up that tradition, talking about the transience of wealth. And then finally, this blessed Makarios in verse 12 again echoes Jesus' tradition, what we find in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 and Luke chapter 6. It's there where Luke says, "Blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who are hungry, they will be filled. Blessed are those who are thirsty, they will get something to drink." And then Luke goes on to say, "And cursed are the wealthy." So what we get here in James is already, it looks like this is some of the bedrock early Jesus material, which is why it was so controversial. I mean, Jesus was crucified, which is a Roman form of capital punishment. Jews did not crucify. Only Romans did that. Actually, nobody else was allowed to crucify. It was specifically Roman. And what made this Jesus movement so controversial was this concept of the divine reversal, because it utterly turned the Roman Empire upside down. So this is, you can see already in the first 12 verses of the letter, James is already making some pretty pointed statements that would upset the Roman world, but also criticize those who might kind of go alongside it. Be that two-faced person who can somehow exist in the Roman world and in God's kingdom. This is or God's empire. This is what's impossible for James. So check this out. Read these passages very closely. Read my material, read Johnson's material, and see what you think about it. This next lecture coming up is verses 13 through 21, and you'll see how it is a continuation. It's kind of the second part of this epitome that will both look back to some of these verses and prefigure what comes next. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email.